Well, welcome everyone. Happy New Year. I would like to call the January 12th, 2024 Colorado Produced Water Consortium meeting to order. Appreciate everyone being here today and participating in this meeting. Our first meeting of 2024. Certainly the 2024 is going to be a busy year for us. Implementing the strategic plan that we developed over the last few months. I think we've got a pretty good agenda today, lots of information to be provided. I think Hope did a good job of kind of highlighting the different things that we're going to be talking about today and why we're talking about them and tying them back to some of the priorities that we developed in our strategic plan. I think, again, the agenda today really ties well into the theme that I tried to introduce at the beginning of our consortium conversations, which is to be curious and not judgmental in our approach, and to really take some time to learn about the depth of knowledge necessary in order to make some of the recommendations that we'll be making over the next year or two. To give a quick overview of the agenda today, we will have public comment. I think there's at least one person that maybe has signed up for public comment today. And then Hope's going to give us an overview of the Department of Natural Resources budget and legislative process. There's been a couple of questions about that. And so keeping in mind that the consortium itself is a recommending body. We're not a body that takes positions on bills, but certainly makes recommendations through the legislative deliverables and our strategic plan. And so she'll give a little bit of information about that. And then Greg Duranlo, who's the ECMC environmental manager, is going to provide an update on ECMC's deliverables associated with House Bill 23-1242 and some of the work that's been done developing the forms on the reporting requirements associated with that. I am excited to let folks know that Hope has just about completed the implementation plan for our strategic plan. And that implementation plan really will inform the timeline and the work that we'll be doing in upcoming meetings. And so she'll take some time today to give an overview of that implementation plan and the different dates that are associated with that, so folks can have a better idea of what meetings are going to look like in 2024. And then Arthur Kepsel, who's our PG Water Resource Protection Environmental Data Specialist, is going to give us an overview and information on the COENV database that's available at ECMC, which is a really great tool. And I think he's going to take some time to show us how to navigate that particular database. And then Tracy Kozloff, who's Colorado Deputy State Engineer, is going to give us a legal water background. In 45 minutes, she's going to explain everything that we need to know about water law. And so excited to hear that presentation as well. I do want to also make sure that we've got time in the agenda for consortium members to be able to ask questions of the different presenters, and then be able to generally provide thoughts and comments. And so I think we'll hold some time towards the end of the agenda to be able to allow that to happen. So with that, I will kick it over to Hope for some general housekeeping.
Thank you, Chair Messner, and welcome consortium members. I am so excited for 2024, and I hope you have your running shoes on, because it's going to be fast and furious in 2024. Just some regular housekeeping, because we are virtual and we do have members of the public listening in and participating. Please remember to state your name for the record each time that you speak. Mute your microphone when you're not speaking. There's a menu at the bottom of our screen, and it does have an ability to raise your hand. Raising your hand will allow Chair Messner to call on you, and we can have a robust discussion. And I really do encourage you to participate in discussions, right? This meeting is about strategic priority, our strategic priority about education and building the consortium's knowledge. So I do encourage you to ask our presenters questions. And if you can even send those questions to me afterwards, if you can't remember, you just think of something later. That's the end of my housekeeping announcements. As Chair Messner mentioned, I've been working with managing results to build out our implementation plan of our strategic plan, and I hope to share that with you for review at our February meeting, and I'll give you some highlights today. I'm also excited to announce we're interviewing for the Assistant Director for Research for the consortium. And I hope that we will be able to find someone this round to support the research capabilities of the consortium. I'm going to be traveling a lot in February. I will be presenting at the Produced Water Society a conference in Houston in the beginning of February. At the end of February, I'll be presenting at the Groundwater Protection Council's Underground Injection Control Conference in Oklahoma City. And then in March, I'll be presenting at the Water Reuse Symposium in Denver. If any of you are going to these, please stop by and say hi. I'll be presenting on the consortium's work. That's all I have for announcements. Back to you, Chair Messner.
Thanks, Hope. Super exciting, and glad you're getting out and sharing some of the work that we're doing here, and learning from other consortiums and other organizations about some of the work that they're doing. I think that's one of our goals as well, is to make sure that we're communicating and coordinating with other entities that are doing similar work as we are. And so that's great that you're doing that. I did fail to announce as well that we have a new consortium member who represents the Raton Basin in John Lipka. And he is a representative of Evergreen Natural Resources, who's an operator that primarily operates in the Raton Basin. And so we welcome John to the consortium. And looking forward to hearing the perspective of the Raton Basin and the conversations that we have. I think next up on the agenda is public comment, and I believe we had a Lauren Bloom who had signed up for public comment. I'm not sure if she's in the meeting or not.
I'm not seeing her on.
Okay, well, maybe we'll keep looking, and if she does show up, then we can pause the meeting and give her an opportunity to share her thoughts. So with that, we're gonna keep rolling down the agenda here, and I'll kick it back over to you, Hope, to give us an overview on the DNR budget and legislative process.
Thank you, John. And did we mention her name? So Laura Bloom submitted a request for a public comment, just for the record. And Laura represents the Western Colorado Alliance, and she plans on submitting general public comments on our strategic plan.
Yeah, I had mentioned, I don't think we see her on the participant list right now, so we'll bring her into the meeting if she shows up. Otherwise, we can reach back out to her and offer that she speak at a future meeting or provide written comment that we can distribute to the consortium.
Thank you. And I am looking for my notes. So in the past month or so, I've received several questions about the Department of Natural Resources legislative process and the consortium's budget. I want to remind everyone that the consortium resides in the Department of Natural Resources Executive Director's Office. And so now I'm going to take an opportunity to provide a high-level overview of the legislative process and the budget process at the Department of Natural Resources. And then I'm going to follow that up with a summary of the consortium's budget. So the legislative process at the Department of Natural Resources kind of begins the year before. So the legislative session begins in January each year, and we all know that the legislative session just started on Wednesday of this year. But the legislative agenda for the Department of Natural Resources was set the prior spring. The Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, begins to develop their annual legislative agenda in roughly April or May of the previous year. The process begins with the Executive Director's Office requesting proposals from each division. DNR has 8 divisions: Reclamation, Mining and Safety, Energy and Carbon Management Commission, State Land Board, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Colorado Water Conservation Board, Division of Water Resources, Colorado Avalanche Information Center, and the Division of Forestry. The Executive Director's Office reviews the proposals, and those that are approved are submitted to the Governor's Office in the summer. This is important to note. The Governor's Office ultimately must approve any legislative proposals from the Department of Natural Resources. If approved, the Governor's Office, the legislative proposals are refined through a stakeholder process in the fall prior to the opening of the legislative session in January. For the legislative session that started on Wednesday, DNR's legislative agenda was decided through the legislative agenda setting process that began in spring of 2023. The consortium will participate in the next legislative agenda setting process by developing the legislative requirement of the consortium to provide recommendations to state agencies and the General Assembly on any legislation needed to remove barriers to the safe recycling and reuse of produced water in the state by November 1st, 2024. As a reminder, members of the consortium should not speak on behalf of the consortium or advocate for or against specific legislative proposals in your capacity as a member of the consortium without first clearing that activity with me, and I will clear it with the Department of Natural Resources Director of Legislative Affairs. You can continue to participate in the process as a member of the public, but not as a member of the consortium. Next, I'd like to discuss the budget process. I'm going to review the Department of Natural Resources budget process. And budgets are assigned to fiscal years. The state's fiscal year begins on July 1st and ends the following June 30th. The annual budget development process begins annually in the spring, typically in late February or early March. And later, the budget eventually becomes effective. Similar to the legislative process, the budget process begins with the Executive Director's Office requesting proposals from each division. The Executive Director's Office reviews the proposals, and those that are approved are submitted to the Governor's Office in the summer. As with legislative proposals, the Governor's Office ultimately must approve the budget proposals, and all deliberations on potential requests remain confidential and internal to the executive branch until the final budget is released. The Governor's budget request is submitted to the legislature on November 1st each year. The Joint Budget Committee, a 6-member committee responsible for assembling A balanced budget for consideration by the General Assembly will review and approve, modify, or reject the budget proposal for funding in what is referred to as the long bill. Once the long bill, and I can provide this link after the meeting for more detail, but it would be the long bill for the fiscal year 23-24. But once the long bill is passed by both the House and the Senate, the final long bill will go to the governor for signature. This typically happens in late April or early May. The Department of Natural Resources budget request, which includes the consortium's budget request for fiscal year 2024-25. So that's the fiscal year that starts July 1st of this year. This was submitted for consideration by the legislature on November 1st, 2023. The consortium will have the opportunity to participate in the department's budget development process for fiscal year 2025-26. I'll coordinate that process with Department of Natural Resources Budget Director. And I just want you to note that departments are required to operate within set budget targets for the purpose of budget balancing, statutory mandates, as well as technical merit. As a reminder, similar to the legislature, the legislative process, members of the consortium should not speak on behalf of the consortium or advocate for or against specific budget proposals in your capacity as a member of the consortium without first clearing that activity with me, and I'll clear it with the Department of Natural Resources Budget Director. So that was a lot. And now we're going to talk about the consortium's budget. The consortium's total budget for FY 23-24 is $242,760. This pays for the salary of 2 full-time employees, the director and the assistant director for research. We have $2,700 for operating expenses, which pays for items such as lunches, for in-person meetings, travel for consortium members and staff, consultants, and any other items we need to operate. Finally, we have $18,221 budgeted for per diem for consortium members to attend meetings. And this number assumes that the consortium meets monthly for this fiscal year. Since we're talking about the per diems, this is the $50 or $200 that you receive for attending the meetings. If you can submit those requests in a timely manner, I will respond to them, and then we'll know our budget numbers a little faster. I don't want to get to June 30th and a member is requesting 12 months of per diem. That's what I'm trying to avoid. For fiscal year 24-25, the budget that was submitted remains mostly the same. The budget will continue to pay the salary for the 2 full-time staff. A small increase in operating expenses of about $200 to $2,935 was requested, and per the requirements of House Bill 23-1242, an annual adjustment of 4.7% for the per diem rate or stipend was requested. If approved, the 4.7% increase results in the per diem increasing from the $50, so this is your meeting attendance, it'll increase from $50 to $52.35. And for those representing disproportionately impacted communities, an increase from an additional $150 to $157.05. The total per diem is $6,360 and is calculated based on the consortium meeting quarterly per House Bill 23-1242. So we're meeting monthly until June 30th of this year, and then we'll be meeting quarterly beginning in July of 2024. As a reminder, the consortium's budget for fiscal year 24-25 has already been submitted and no changes are expected. So now I think, Commissioner Messner, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Hope. Thanks for the overview. I think that was good. And I think it's also important to note that, some of the budgets that were set were a result of the fiscal note associated with House Bill 23-1242 and the budget that was allocated associated with that. I think there's certainly, a hope and an intent to find additional funding streams and funding mechanisms for the consortium, particularly in the work that we're doing around research or case studies or pilot projects or additional reports. And I think once we get the Assistant Director of Research on board, I think one of the primary goals of that particular individual is to continue to search out additional funding sources and mechanisms to be able to expand and continue the work that we're doing. I know that a number of folks are disappointed that some of the meetings now will be held virtually, and that is a direct result of some of the budget constraints that we have associated with the consortium at this point. I do actually hope, and I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to develop funding streams to be able to have some in-person meetings, in the near future. And so I will continue to be proactive in trying to develop funding sources that will enable us to be able to meet in person, at least be able to meet, 2 or 3 times a year in person. And then I know that a lot of folks are also interested in doing field trips or site visits in different parts of the state for different projects or different things that would be important for us to be able to see. And so that's also something that I'm going to be actively trying to secure, which is funding to be able to do some of that work. And so while a lot of our work here initially is going to have to be done virtually, I do think that we'll continue to expand the capacity of the consortium and be able to expand some of the work that we're doing. And hopefully that includes more in-person meetings and activities. So with that, does anyone have any questions for Hope on the information that she provided? If so, just raise your hand. Well, Hope, I think you've provided enough information. I didn't see any questions. So with that, let's kick it over to Greg Duranlo, who's the ECMC Environmental Manager, for an update on the deliverables associated with House Bill 23-1242 for ECMC. Greg?
Thank you, Chair Messner. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's great to see all these faces here, many of whom I've worked with over my years at ECMC and prior COGCC. There's a lot of horsepower in this room. So that really just makes me excited about what the work that you guys are undertaking and just the part that ECMC will play in that. I'm going to try and share my screen. As Chair Messner said, I am Greg Duranlo. I'm the Environmental Unit Manager here at ECMC. And I take it just a mic check. You can all hear me okay, and you can see my screen. Great, thanks. So this update will be brief and frankly, more brief than I had hoped to be able to give at this point in time. But I just want to go through where ECMC is with respect to implementing the sort of nuts and bolts of data collection associated with HB 23-1242. Just this timeline, from the time the bill was signed into law in June of 2023 In July of 2023, ECMC introduced the topic of data collection on a monthly basis by well. With the way the statute was laid out, the reporting that was required to begin in September of 2023 was tied to the production reporting. Production reports lag 45 days from the actual dates of production. So in order to be reporting in September of 2023, operators needed to be reporting data that was collected in July of 2023. So when we rolled this out in early July, that came as a surprise to many operators, and basically meant that they were going to have to be developing their tools for collecting and reporting the data at the same time that ECMC was developing our tools to receive and intake the information. Operators have then, starting in September, have begun to report to ECMC, and we rolled out basically the final templates of the data reporting in September, and our partnership with the Governor's Office of Information Technology was working to develop the modifications to the monthly production reports at the same time. And so since we didn't have that tool developed yet, we asked operators to basically submit via spreadsheet and via email their produced water and water reporting data. We thought that process would go quicker. There were a number of reasons that forms development process were delayed. And in October, we updated them saying it's going to be ready very soon. And we are now to the point that we are expecting that form to be finalized today. We have delivered it to our final testers, and they will be able to test the final version of the Form 7 produced water data report. In December of 2023, we began the recruiting of 2 full-time equivalent positions here at ECMC to support the efforts that you all are undertaking. That included an EPS2 and a data manager. We have hired the EPS2. That individual starts on Tuesday, right after the holiday weekend. Actually, their start date is Monday. And the data manager, we are actively recruiting that and very close to finalizing that recruitment. So we're very excited about the folks that we have been able to interview for those positions and work with to hopefully bring on board. So the statute required 2 components of reporting. The first was the monthly reporting by well, and the second is the quarterly reporting by location. And so what I've described previously was the monthly reporting by well. We are working now, and we introduced the templates for the quarterly reporting by location earlier this week. And those templates have gone into development. And we're actually very optimistic that this process will be faster than our prior development effort for a number of reasons. And so we look to have that form, the development and testing, done in January, with the testing kind of bleeding into February, and then be able to release that by February 14th, when operators would be required to report for the prior quarter. So as far as the data that we've received to date, and this is all by email, as of the end of 2023, we received 4 months of data: July, August, September, October. 32 operators reported data to us, and over 130,000 rows of data were included on those spreadsheets. So obviously that's, the average report had about 1,300 rows. Obviously that's not really data that you can manage in a number of spreadsheets and really extract meaning from. So what we've asked operators to do is go back once we release the final version of the Form 7 updates. We will ask them to resubmit the data that they've submitted via email so that it gets populated into our database. The final modifications and release is expected today. I've optimistically said that a few times, but this time I'm really hopeful for that. And Mike, I see your question. I'll go ahead and take that now.
Thanks, Greg, and Hope and Greg. Would you like me to wait until the end for questions, or should I just go ahead now?
I'm fine either way. It's up to you guys. I
Great.
suppose.
Well, thank you for this information. I just had a question about the 32 operators. That's not, what percentage of the total operators in the state does that represent? I mean, it looks like a number of operators may not have filed their reports yet. Is that the case? And do you have a sense of why that might be?
Yeah, so that is the case. I would say there's, there's 500 registered operators, but there's really, that's a much higher number than what we really have as what we would consider active operators, and so I will say that we've received reports from operators who are reporting 10,000 rows of data and operators who are reporting 4. So we're seeing reports across the spectrum. I don't have an answer as to why certain operators are not reporting. There may be, there are a number of operators whose operations are dry gas production. There's no liquids associated with their operations, so they wouldn't be required to report. That's Yuma County, some of the Moffat County stuff. And there's other operators who may simply not have an awareness of that. And frankly, until we get these data into our database, it's hard to go through and say who are the ones we're missing, and let's send them a note to ping them. I have, over the months, I've received a few emails from operators saying, "Hey, this is something new. I didn't know about this. Help me out here." And so we've tried to bring those operators on board as well. So I think once we get this in the database and can really look at the operators that we've received from and start to send out some notices to others that they're missing some reporting, I think that'll help. Additionally, once it's actually established on the Form 7, they won't be able to submit their monthly production reports without acknowledging something about the water side. So had we gotten that earlier, we would probably have a higher percentage of reporting.
Got it. So once this is incorporated into the monthly production report form, even the dry gas operators will have to say something about what their water production or lack of water production is, basically.
Correct. They'll have to check a box that says we have no water to report per the statute.
Yeah. Okay. One just follow-up question. I understand that a lot of the 500 operators are not really active. Just ballpark, how many operators would you consider sort of being active right now in the state?
I'm not prepared to answer that question, Mike. I could get that for you, but I'm honestly, I'm not prepared.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yep. I think I've covered everything there. I wanted to just show you a couple of examples of the data that we are receiving from operators, just so you had a feel for what it's looking like. I've removed the operator information from this just to show sort of the well data. So this is reporting by well, and you'll see like the first 3 rows here are individual wells in which there's only 1 row of data reported. We've got fresh water used. We've got no recycled or reused water used. We've got some water produced for commercial disposal and that's a commercial class 2 injection well. And then here's the disposal location where that went. These first 3 wells, pretty simple reporting. The next groups of wells have basically what happened is they took water produced from those wells and sent it to 4 different locations for disposal. So each one of those wells requires 4 rows of data to report. And so that's why when I reported, or when I stated earlier, we've received 130,000 rows of data, that doesn't mean we've received reports on 130,000 wells. And so once we get the data into our database and can really start to analyze that, we can determine how many wells are being reported and how many locations are being reported, et cetera. So that's what some of the data reports look like, just in raw form. Here's another one. This is also from a DJ Basin operator. And, you know, again, here you can see that there's freshwater use reported, some recycled, reused water reported. These are individual rows for each well. There are also some wells down here where some water was was produced and reused on site for certain purposes. It looks like they probably did some work over work there. Tracy, another question.
Thank you, Greg. You're showing the data here gives me an opportunity to ask a question I've been wondering about, which I think is, it may not be a question for you, Greg, but maybe more for the consortium broadly, or Hope or Commissioner Mesner. But so let me just get to my question though. So column L, freshwater used, column M, recycled, reused water used. So I think that's the amount of water that operator is putting down the hole to do their processes, right? Okay. And then we move across to the right, produced water for disposal, or produced water for recycling and reuse. Is that your R&R? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And so then when I look at the Produced Water Consortium's website states the primary goal of the consortium is to reduce the use of fresh water and increase the recycling of produced water in oil and gas operations. And so I guess I just want to make sure that my understanding of that matches everybody's. That so the first part, primary goal, reduce the use of fresh water. So that would be, let's make column L less. And then the second part is increase the recycling of produced water in oil and gas operations. And so I think that would be, we want to see less of column M, produced water, going into disposal, and we want to see more of their reuse columns. Like we'd like to push things from N to like O and R to their reuse. And I just want to make sure that like all of us as a consortium see, yeah, that is our big goal here.
I think it sounds like then I can't really answer that question.
And this might not be the right time, but and we can touch on that in my talk too. But I guess I actually have thought it can be confusing, because I feel like we're talking about 2 parts of water. We're talking about the water that goes down the hole and the amount that comes up later and what we do with that. And maybe that could be a distinction that can get lost sometimes. I don't know if anyone on the consortium would want to speak to that, or I can just be quiet for now and talk about
Tracy,
that.
I actually think you bring up a good point, and you know, I think at least from my standpoint, the answer is yes, right? So I mean, there's 2 ends of this spectrum, right? I mean, one, the kind of overarching goal is how do we reduce the amount of fresh water that's being utilized in oil and gas activities? And so what does that mean? I think the consortium is going to have conversations to try to figure out exactly what that means. But does that mean, you know, different technology becomes available that does not require the amount of fresh water or amount of water in general that's being utilized currently in different operations? Does that mean that you're replacing some of the fresh water that's currently being used with produced water? Does that mean that you're replacing some of the fresh water that's currently being used with other other industrial water or non-tributary water, or what does that mean, right? So what does it mean to reduce fresh water use? And I think that's something that we're going to have to chew on here. And then B, the second part of that you had identified is we've got a certain amount of water that's coming out of the ground as part of oil and gas activities. Some of that water is currently being re-injected back into the ground through disposal processes. Are there opportunities for us to increase the amount of water that's actually being utilized, that's being reused and recycled, so that in the end, less water is having to be disposed in the ground, right? And so I think the answer to your question is really is yes, right? But the specificity on that and the recommendations that we ultimately make in order to come up with strategies for how that happens is really what we're being asked to chew on here. And so I think part of the discussion that occurred in the development of this legislation was, in order for us to be able to have intelligent discussions on the topics that you bring up, we need to have a data set available to us to really understand how much fresh water is currently being used, how much produced water is currently coming out of the ground, how much is currently being reused and recycled in different areas, different basins around the state. And that data set may help us make good informed decisions on strategies for different areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it makes me think, our name is the Produced Water Consortium, but that's only part of what we're talking about, because the produced water is what is coming up. But we also have a goal of reducing the amount of water that is fresh water that's used to go down the hole. And in my mind, that's not produced water, that's something else. That's the water supply for oil and gas activities. And
Sure.
we have a goal around that type of water also.
Yes.
So, okay, thank you for that.
Greg, you got a bunch of questions. And I think Nikki Wells was next.
Excuse me. I just have a question about the data. Like, how come they weren't obligated to report? And then right now we only have not even half of the data collected. How long is it going to take to get the data, then go through the data, and us get the numbers?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And as I said at the beginning, I would like to have been in a position to have more to report here. We had a number of reasons that the development of the data collection tools were delayed. And so I guess to the first part of your question, how come they weren't required to report? The statute does require them to report. And much like other requirements, we get voluntary compliance on those requirements from some operators, and others need a nudge. And so, there are a number of operators who probably were not, aware of how this requirement applied. I think, not having the tool on the monthly production report probably led some others to, feel that the requirement wasn't there. We will attempt to go back and get as much of that data as we can. In the meantime, the data that we do get, and we will start working with as soon as we get it uploaded into the database. And so as the team, that is working in our water environmental data group under Arthur Kepsel, who will be presenting later, he's hiring 2 individuals to start working with that data, develop reports that can be presented to you that bring meaning to this discussion. And so I appreciate your your sentiment there is, hey, let's give us something we can work with, and that's absolutely what our intent is. But first, we do have to build the tools to collect the data.
How long is that going to take?
Again, we expect to release the tool to actually take the data that you're seeing here, put it into our database. We're expecting to release that today. And so that data then will be available for us to start to work with and sort through, immediately. I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take to look through those first 130,000 rows, but we will endeavor to, start building that data set and building reports and tools. Our hope is that we can start building some geospatial tools that you all can actually use and manipulate the data, so that you're not actually waiting on us to deliver a report that isn't quite what you wanted to see anyway. Instead, I'm hoping that we're going to have tools that you all will be available or able to use through that process. So, again, we're hiring people, we're bringing them up to speed. You all are getting up to speed, and we're moving forward as fast as we can.
Okay, just one more thing. And then you're collecting this data and stuff. How do you guys ensure that the data you're collecting is updated for us? Like how often are they required to report?
Sure. So this is monthly reporting on a well-by-well basis. And then the other set of data that will begin to be reported February 14th is reported quarterly on a location by location basis. And the distinction there, this is, as Tracy pointed out, this is, water that's going down one single oil and gas well and being produced from one single oil and gas well. Much of the water is managed on a location basis, including in centralized exploration, production, waste management facilities. And so those aren't necessarily captured by this form, which is why we're developing the quarterly reporting by location tool to intake data that looks at that water use on a location by location basis, which we hope will provide some insight into sort of the bigger picture water movement throughout individual fields, basins, and areas of the state.
Thank you.
How about Barbara Vasquez had her hand up?
Sure, I think Mike beat me to it, but I'm glad to go first if you don't mind, Mike. I want to follow up on Tracy's comment. There is freshwater use that isn't downhole on sites, dust suppression, etc. What is your instruction, Greg, to the operators on what water use is being reported in column L?
So again, what you're seeing here is the monthly water reporting by well. And in the next couple slides I have, but haven't had a chance to go through, are the quarterly reporting by location. And in fact, on one of these slides is freshwater. And this is freshwater, including the source of that freshwater based on industrial, commercial, municipal, and agricultural sources. And for each location, the operator will be reporting all of the fresh water used at the location. So that will include, let's say they had they constructed the location and drilled 4 wells. How much fresh water did it take to do all of the dust suppression work, the construction, if they needed additional water for compaction or things like that? How much fresh water was used on that location for those purposes, and all of the fresh water that is used downhole on the 4 wells that were on that pad.
Thanks.
Does that answer
Can you
your
go
question?
back to the can you go back to the well by well data slide?
Sure.
So it's kind of odd that all of these wells in the middle of the page are reporting the same volume sent to disposal. Is that because the metrology device to measure the volume is only after it's all been piped together out of that field or that pad, and they can't measure the amount by well?
Yeah, so on the, there's some data that's not shown here that is on the production report, which is the volume of water produced from each well. And so they may have, let's say, you know, those wells produced a range from 150 to 270 barrels of water, each of those wells. But they had a truck come on site, and that they know, they report that data into the tanks, and then a truck comes on site, offloads, you know, 100 and some barrels, you know, offloads, and then the truck comes back and makes 5 trips, and they take that water off site. They don't know which well particularly that water came off of, so they're going to divide that among the wells that produced into those tanks. So it's
So I
not,
think the answer to the question is we're not going to see per well data for some of these sites. Is that what you're saying?
so they can't report the disposal until it's actually gone to disposal. And so, and it is aggregated over the wells before it goes to disposal. And so we know how much water each well produced, and we know the total amount of water that was disposed of. And so with those two, I think that's going to give us valuable data to review for the disposal purposes.
Yeah. So in this spreadsheet, what column represents the volume of water produced from a specific well?
It's not on this spreadsheet. It's already required to be reported under the Form 7 monthly production report. So we already have that coming into our database. So we didn't need to duplicate that data here on this spreadsheet.
And then once the Form 7 is finalized and the operators start using it, we will see that on the Form 7.
Then we
Okay,
can put those
thank you.
two things together. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Mike Freeman.
Thanks. Hey, Greg, I just had a couple of questions. Looking at some of the same entries that Barbara asked about, Miller, like maybe the gutters and federal wells. It looks like, I'm just curious about the math and how they'll relate to each other. It looks like, for example, one well said 1450 freshwater used, but in terms of what was produced, 90,000 cubic feet disposed and 150 was reused. So is the remainder of that going to be water that stayed down hole? You know, where's the remainder of that 1450 going exactly? Is it stuff that didn't come, that was remained down hole, or what happened exactly?
Sure. So I can't exactly speak for the operator on this, and I haven't dug in too deeply on this, but here's some thoughts that I would have looking at this data. The freshwater used, the 1450, and we're just looking at those 4 Gutterson federal state wells for this. So they acquired 1,450 barrels of water and used it downhole for various purposes. They may have done workovers on these wells, or maybe they were drilling surface casing. Either of those could have been the case. The wells produce some volume of water that, frankly, we don't know from what we're looking at here because it's reported on a different form. Okay. Ultimately, we will know that, and we will have those side by side.
And do remember, folks, this is preliminary data, right? So, I mean, we be careful trying to extrapolate too much off of this spreadsheet because it's not the final product yet. So,
and so, but they are telling us that they sent 90 barrels from each of those wells off-site for disposal. And again, I'm assuming that they had water produced from the wells, aggregated on site, and removed from the site for disposal. The MCF, it didn't occur to me till last evening that that's a terrible initialism that I've used there, or that we've used there, because what that is our disposal methods as defined by rule. One of them is commercial, and the moniker that we've used for commercial disposal over time is M. And then the CF indicates that's a commercial facility. Typically, that would be a solid waste facility. We also have MI.
So we're not talking about thousands of cubic feet.
We're not
This is-
talking about
these are
1,000
all,
cubic
all
feet.
in barrels, basically.
Correct,
Okay,
correct.
all right,
That
got
is
it.
the disposal method that is indicated there, and I apologize for that. And that's going to cause me confusion, I see, into the future. And yeah. Anyway, and so we know that was aggregated water sent to disposal at a commercial facility. The 150 barrels is also aggregated water that was reused back on site. So that water was probably sent to frac tanks on site and then cycled back into use on site. What we don't see is in column M, we don't see that water going back down in the hole. So they may be just holding that water on site. And next month, we may see those same wells reported with recycled and reused water going downhole.
Yeah.
So
So
there's
the-
always going to be this storativity question. And, how much of the water is going to either on-site and being stored but not used, or off-site. We had some other discrepancies show up in early data. Operators were piping water to disposal. Well, they had a 6-mile, 8-inch diameter pipeline. And then they were receiving invoices for the disposal on the other end of that pipeline. Well, there's a lot of barrels sitting in that pipeline that they're not being invoiced for. They've left the site, but they haven't disposed of them because they haven't arrived at the disposal site for. So we had a discrepancy there too. So some of those things are going to, they will level out over time because the reporting will sort of catch up and equalize. And so looking at 1 month of data isn't going to be as useful as looking at a data series across time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. One other question, real quick. As I think for all the reasons that John and Tracy mentioned, I think these columns and the data, the information are going to be a really, really valuable and important data source for our work. And I think a lot of members of the public will be very interested. Will this all be sort of publicly available on the website through the normal data access tools, basically?
Yes, sir. We intend to have this put out there very transparently, but it's going to take us some time to build that. As I mentioned earlier, I hope to have some data tools that people can use and pull and extract data from it. So that's why we're super excited about the individuals that we've hired to work in that space, or the one individual and the other that we hope to bring on to work in that space of building out those data tools.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Looks like we got 2 more questions, Greg, and I know that you've got perhaps a few more slides. Keeping in mind,
This is Doug
now.
White. I have a statement real quick. Doug White, NGL. Sorry, Irene. I just want to clarify some facts. We take 80% of disposal water in the basin, so approximately. We need to remind ourselves, or maybe educate ourselves also, that this fresh water, when it is used in a frac or drilling, it takes a very long time for 100%, and sometimes not 100% of it comes back to the surface. A portion of it remains in the reservoir, and as the oil is produced, oil and gas, hydrocarbons are produced. That's why it's called produced water many times, is produced out of the well. So even on a month to month, month over month, it may take dozens of months and maybe years for that amount of fresh water used in the development of that well to be tied out to whether it be disposal or recycle or reuse. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment, Doug. I would remind folks, though, not to jump in and make comments unless I call on you, so I appreciate that.
Understood.
We do have just a little bit of time left here, so I want to make sure Greg has enough time to finish his presentation, but we will hear from Irene here quick with a question.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation, Greg. This is Irene Andrews speaking. I've got several hopefully quick questions. One is, do we want to add a column for basin two, do we want to add a column for location? Location would also then tie this data that we're collecting to the monthly data, the quarterly data that we need to be collecting. And then three, I wanted to know if we can have some input when you're doing the database tools, because we know we are the end user and we know what kind of queries we're going to need to be asking. And it would be great if we don't get that we get to beta test it and work with you to help define what some of those queries could be.
So the first two questions, we do not need to add those columns because it's already in our database, right? So in this one, we have the columns H and I are the well ID. And in our database, there's a relationship between the
Okay.
well ID and the location. And
Okay.
then all of that, we know exactly where that location or where that well is and where that location is geospatially. So we can pull from what we already have, we can pull that.
Okay.
And so you're absolutely right. We need that information.
Mhm.
Like the volume of water that's produced from a well, we're already getting that information. We already have
Got
that
it.
information. So
And then, oh, sorry.
yeah, so with respect to the tools and the Produced Water Consortium being the end user of those tools, I think that's an absolutely fantastic idea. And I would say that we will coordinate directly with Hope and the Assistant Director for Research on those matters. I mean, we'll be working closely with as we develop those tools. So certainly that's, you know, we want what we build to be of value to your work. That's the bottom line there. So
And then two of the other mandates that we have in the bill are that we want to, you know, get rid of the roadblocks that are stopping people from using produced water. So it would be good to also be capturing the data as to why someone didn't use produced water when it was available, why they resorted to fresh. And also two, are we collecting information about the projected need of water so that we can, that we're also going to need that in order to problem solve for solutions like where to put infrastructure or how to handle where storage pads should be. We're going to need to know what people anticipate their water needs to be. Are we capturing that?
So I think that some of that anticipation information is submitted with the oil and gas development plans to ECMC.
Okay.
And so I believe that that is, you know, something that will be available to this group through the cumulative impacts data repository, which, but you know, I'll have to think about that a little bit more as to how that builds out.
Good.
Your point, your question about, you know, should we get information as to the why?
Just so we can do root cause analysis.
Yeah, I think that may be something that once we start to aggregate data that's sort of a go back to and ask, you know, look at operators and say, okay, now let's get some description. I think if we tried to build that into this type of form, we would get so many text fields with so much language that it would be next to impossible to actually extract meaning from.
No, it would really have to be just a choice of 5 things. Was it A, B, C, D, or
right,
E?
right. And so, and that is a good point, and maybe that is something that gets added to this moving forward. So
Thank
that
you.
is a good point.
Thank you for your time.
I don't see any more questions, Greg. So if you want to continue on.
So I kind of gave a hint here that these are just the data fields that we will be collecting for the quarterly reporting by location. And I don't really need to go through them with this team. I don't think, you know, we organized it so that it's production, freshwater, and then the recycle reuse, both coming onto a location, going off of the location, and where it's coming from and where it's going. I'm assuming that this group will have access to these slides once I'm done with this. And it may be better to just, put these kind of in your hands. I've described the examples so that people can see kind of what's going on in these reports. And then, and lastly, we talk about disposal, which again, this is already reported on the per well basis, but this aggregates it for the location. So it may be better to just kind of put that in your hands. There's a couple of and let you guys play around with it. So and I will be back in future months to kind of go through where we're at, hopefully with some better information to report on actual data, because I know that is what you all are really chomping at the bit to have, and so that's what I want to be delivering to.
I appreciate that, Greg, and appreciate all the work that you've done on this. I mean, I'm not sure that everyone fully grasps the challenges with developing the reporting tool that's necessary in order to be able to develop this information and then be able to put it into a format that it's a searchable database so that it ends up being usable. And so I understood that it takes time in order to develop that, and then it will take time to ensure that the reporting is done accurately and that everyone is reporting. And so appreciate the work that's being done. All these slides will be provided to all the consortium members, and inevitably there'll be additional questions, which I certainly encourage about this information, understanding that this again is preliminary information. More specificity in that and more digestible format is going to come once the Form 7 formally gets rolled out today, right? And tomorrow, today, Tuesday.
We've got it. We're putting it in the hands of two industry testers who we've been working with, and it's just like, okay, one last time, test this before we release it to everyone.
Okay. And so if folks do have questions about that and want to provide written questions, you can certainly provide that to Hope and myself, and I would certainly be happy to forward those on to Greg or to Arthur and get some questions answered between meetings here, but we'll hear from Greg in future meetings as well. And so this is not the only time we'll hear about this topic. With that, a little bit behind here, so I want to move on to Hope and the presentation on the timeline and upcoming meeting topics to kind of frame what the next few months are going to look like for the consortium and the timelines associated with the work that we're going to be doing, and really appreciative of the hard work that Hope's put in developing the implementation plan that really formalizes the strategic plan that we created a few months ago. And so with that, I'll kick it over to Hope.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Jenny, for sharing my slides. I really appreciate it. So I have been working on the implementation plan, and this is just a really quick overview. There are much more details that I'll be sharing in the future. Next slide. I wanted to remind people of our primary goal, which thank you, Tracy, for putting into the chat. The primary goal of the consortium is to reduce the use of fresh water and increase the recycling of produced water in oil and gas operations. This primary goal drove our strategic plan, and we developed the following 5 strategic priorities, which is implementing legislative requirements, education, communities and environment, research, and identifying regulatory and policy recommendations. This first year is operational. It's mostly focused on implementing legislative requirements, but as you saw today, we're incorporating some of the other strategic priorities, such as education, into our overall time plan of implementing the legislative requirements. Next slide. I'm not going to talk through this slide, but you'll have these slides after the meeting, and many of you do on the consortium do have this slide presentation now. The general public, I'll email that after the meeting. And I'm going to talk in detail about these. Next slide. So for the remainder of fiscal year 2023-2024, so that's January through June 30th of this year, we're going to focus on the first three deliverables as stated in House Bill 23-1242. We're going to develop guidance documents for in-field reuse and recycling. I reported on this timeline at our December meeting, and it got a little more compressed than I had expected. So in general, the consortium will provide guidance to staff on how to approach the deliverable. Staff will draft a deliverable. The consortium will review that draft at a meeting, and then the consortium will finalize the draft once staff has incorporated all of their comments at the following meeting. And then it will be submitted to the General Assembly through the Department of Natural Resources Director of Legislative Affairs. So what I mean about a little bit compressed, our first deliverable, I received guidance to follow a standard literature review method, and so we'll be using that methodology. I didn't formally bring it to the consortium. We will be reviewing this deliverable. I thought that we would be able to review a draft at our February meeting, but we do have to finalize the deliverable prior to the legislative due date. Because our March meeting is after March 1st, we will be reviewing the draft at our February meeting. I'll take comments at our February meeting, and I hope to ask the consortium to finalize this document with comments at February's meeting. So then we'll hopefully be back on track of providing guidance. You'll have an opportunity to review the draft deliverable and finalize at the meeting. So we'll follow that for coordinating state and federal regulatory policies. So you'll provide guidance at the February meeting, then you'll review the draft, then you'll finalize the draft, and we'll submit it to the General Assembly. And then the final deliverable for this fiscal year will be the analyze infrastructure storage and treatment facilities. Next slide. Now I'd like to talk about the first half of fiscal year 2024-2025. So that would be July 1st through December 31st. And those are the first 6 months of our new fiscal year. We do only have meetings scheduled through July 12th of 2024. What happens in starting July 1st at the beginning of our fiscal year, our new fiscal year, the legislation allows for quarterly meetings. We have our first quarterly meeting scheduled for July 12th. The reason the other dates are in blue is we have not scheduled our second quarterly meeting. And as you might expect, we haven't scheduled our third or fourth quarterly meeting. So we'll begin the fiscal year, actually, our deliverables will begin in May, but the first thing we'll finalize in our next fiscal year is report on availability of produced water for reuse and recycling. Greg's presentation was the beginning of this deliverable. Then we'll talk about infrastructure, storage, and technology, and we'll finalize that and second quarter. Also at that second quarterly meeting, we'll be finalizing our recommendations of priority topics for agencies. We'll recommend legislation and rules to remove barriers, and then we'll recommend short and long-term goals. When I do present the implementation plan, there'll be many more activities built into these deliverables so that we have a robust deliverable that incorporates all voices. So next slide. Now I'd like to discuss our second half of fiscal year 24-25. So that would be January 1st through June 30th of 2025. We only have one deliverable for that time period. We will begin it. Actually, we'll be beginning the activities towards evaluation of analytical and toxicological methods at our February meeting because it is a really complex topic. And so we'll start building the consortium's knowledge as quickly as we can. But we'll revisit this calendar multiple times throughout the year. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about our next meeting so that you can kind of prepare in your head for the work that needs to be done. So I'll be working on this first deliverable about case studies and best practices. We started that in our December meeting, and actually before that, even before the consortium was established, people started sharing best practices and case studies. And so we're building our library. And so we will put an analysis of that into a report. You'll receive that January 26th. You'll have 2 weeks to review it. We will ask the community to review it by placing the draft online, and they can sign up for public comment. We'll discuss the draft report and finalize it with the recommended comments from the consortium members and from the public at our next meeting. I'll take all of those comments. We'll finalize the report. We'll submit it to DNR leadership so that they can submit it to the General Assembly as part of our legislative requirement. And the other thing is at the February meeting, we'll start work on our second deliverable. I will ask the consortium to give guidance on how to best develop recommendations on how state and federal agencies can better coordinate regulatory policies. This work began in December when we heard from our federal and state partners on some of the regulatory policies that could be coordinated and building that, that knowledge. Next slide. But wait, that's not all. So we have a part 2 of our February meeting, and we're going to be building the consortium's knowledge by having presentations from members of our consortium on how produced water is currently being reused and recycled in Colorado. And that's, again, supporting these best practices, building the consortium's knowledge. We'll also have a presentation from a consortium member on what we know about chemical constituents that are found in produced water. And that's building towards that last deliverable, deliverable 9, that's due July 1st of 2025. Next slide. So the key takeaways from this presentation: year 1 is operational and focused on implementing the legislative requirements. The second takeaway, the first 5 legislative requirements will be used to inform the remaining 3 legislative requirements for 2024. We'll be working simultaneously on all of the requirements, but the first 5 that are being used are really focused on data and building knowledge. They are finalized September 1st, and they will be used to inform our recommendations and the recommendations for our goals for Colorado. And then a reminder of our primary goal is to reduce the use of fresh water and increase the recycling of produced water in oil and gas operations. Thank you, and I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thanks for that, Hope. A lot of work to be able to put dates and to be able to structure the work that we've got to do over the next year. So I appreciate the work that you've done on that. And I think once folks actually see the full implementation plan in their hands, they'll understand that there's a number of action items underneath each of those topics that'll be undertaken as well, with specific dates and results associated with those. And so that level of detail and work is really appreciated. It also appears to me, and I'm just speaking for myself, that and happy to have a conversation with the consortium itself in the future, but it may be necessary for us to consider more than quarterly meetings in the next fiscal year as well. And I understand we've got some budget constraints associated with that, and so there's some considerations there, but it does appear that the amount of work that we have to do may not be able to be accomplished in quarterly meetings. So you don't need to comment on that, Hope. That's just coming from me. Question for Mike.
Thanks, John, and Hope, thanks for putting this together. It is obviously a lot of work just to create a roadmap for an implementation plan for all of our deliverables. So thanks again for all your work on putting it together and into kind of a specific plan with dates. I had a question about what you're looking for from us on February 9th regarding guidance on how to better coordinate regulatory programs on this. I feel like I think the presentations we're getting and the ones we're going to get today from Tracy are really invaluable, but it would be helpful for me in terms of thinking through these issues and what guidance to give, to have some discussion and more input, discussion, frankly, among consortium members about what the issues are and where the opportunities and are for better coordination. On February 9th, are you looking for guidance just on sort of what our process is to develop these recommendations, or are you looking for something more substantive from us about what a set of recommendations and a report ought to look like? Does that make sense?
Thank you, Mike, for the question. And Commissioner Messner, I'll probably hand it off to you for more comments. But what I've received so far from consortium members towards this is to contact X, Y, or Z regulatory agency and have them present about the current state of regulations. And I'll hand it off to you, John, for more comment.
Sure. No, I mean, good question, Mike. I mean, I think the structure that we're looking at here really, it starts with kind of that knowledge base, right? And so I think there was on that topic in particular, there was an attempt to try to create a baseline of knowledge, at least of current state of how different regulatory agencies approach produced water and coordinate with one another. And then on February 9th, on this particular topic, to actually have that discussion that you're talking about. So have an open discussion amongst consortium members about what's working, any suggestions that consortium members may have on ways to, improve that coordination or reimagine that coordination, or things that perhaps are missing, or things that are really good that are happening, and have that discussion. And from that discussion, kind of refine some direction for the director. So as she starts to develop a a work product on recommendations associated with, improving coordination between state and federal agencies. She has the benefit of hearing our discussion and then the kind of that refinement of perhaps some suggestions that we have. At that point, she's able to develop a draft work product. That work product comes back to us for comments and refinement. And then the director has an opportunity to finalize that work product based on, a second round of conversations that we have, and then finalize that deliverable. So conceptually, that's how we hope each of these deliverables process may work. So like that initial conversation is really more of a brainstorm that provides some initial guidance, the development of a draft, another discussion that refines that draft into a final work product, and then a final work product gets developed. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you. And I think my concern or my question really is sort of the second half of what you described is if we have our initial brainstorming discussion on February 9th, I think that's a great way to start the discussion, but that I think coming up with recommendations and guidance will, I think, need some refinement, and maybe, we should keep in mind and anticipate that there may be some, follow-up conversations that are needed that might be a little more focused on that specific deliverable, just to make sure that we've issue spotted and thought the issue completely through. And frankly, I feel like I have a lot to learn on this, and so I'm anxious to hear from agency folks on the consortium, what, and fully understand how we can do this better with the existing regulatory framework.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think it's also important to understand that certain topics are going to take multiple meetings, right? So it's not magically going to happen in 3 meetings on some of this stuff. And, on some of these topics, I would love to take 6 months of discussions in order to be able to
Sure.
develop some of this stuff. But, we are bound by dates that are in legislation. And so we have to abide by those dates. And so some of these conversations will be a little compressed.
Yeah, no, I totally get we've got those statutory deadlines, and I know that I won't be, I'll still be in learning mode to a large degree on February 9th, and I'm hopeful that we'll have a chance to digest it and have some more discussion before we put anything out there in final, so.
Understood. Any other questions for Hope? Barbara?
Yeah, following up on Mike's comment, is it possible, given the budgetary constraints, to have a short meeting where we're all together to discuss the final product before it actually gets delivered?
On which topic? Or are you talking about any topic?
No, I'm talking about the deliverable that Michael was talking about, where we brainstorm in February, but it has to be delivered before we meet in March.
Oh, correct me if I'm wrong, but that deliverable is not due in March. It's the literature review that's done in March. So the one that we start in February will have 3 meetings that will be able to analyze that particular topic before the deliverable is actually due. So it's the only one that's compressed right now is the deliverable number 1, which is the literature review for guidance and case studies for in-field reuse and recycling, which is really a literature review and a compilation of different best practices.
But it's not the regulatory discussion that Mike was having with you.
It is not. That discussion starts on February 9th, and I think the deliverables in May. So we've got 3 months to work through that one.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I see that Trish put something in the chat that she's going to buy us all lunch for in-person meetings. And so thanks, Trish. I appreciate that. That'll save us some money. Oh, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think that there's opportunities for us to consider ways to save money to allow for additional in-person meetings. And like I indicated at the beginning of the meeting, you know, I feel some responsibility to chase some funds as well, to be able to develop a additional budget for us to be able to meet in person. So I know that I'm working diligently on that, but in the meantime, we'll be doing some initial meetings here virtually until I'm able to work my magic. So Hope, if there's any other, since I don't see any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and take our morning break. We're a little bit behind here, so I'm gonna suggest that we take a 7-minute break and return at 10:40, and then maybe we can get a little ahead of schedule for the next part of the meeting. So we'll see everyone back at 10:40. 10:40, we'll go ahead and continue the meeting. Thanks everyone for shortening up your break a little bit. I do want to make sure that we get through the agenda today because we've got some, I think the next couple of topics are really good topics and I think will interest folks. And I imagine folks are going to have a number of questions on these. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Arthur Kepsel, who's a water resource protection and environmental data specialist with ECMC. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you, John. I'm Arthur Kepsel. I am the Environmental Data Group Supervisor. And what I was going to talk to you about today is a little bit about our sampling rules and our analytical data, and particularly how it relates to the produced water. So a little bit of background before I get started. Colorado has approximately 100,000 oil and gas well records with approaching 50,000 active wells. In 2023, we had about 1,000 applications for drilling permits and 770 well starts were begun. In Colorado, we have horizontal drilling, conventional vertical drilling, coal bed methane wells, with approximately 90% of our wells being horizontal wells. The highest number of these wells occur to the north of Denver in the Julesburg Basin. And Colorado's regulatory scheme changed greatly in 2019 with the passage of Senate Bill SB 19181, which changed the mission of the agency from fostering to regulating oil and gas in a manner that's protective of the public health, safety, welfare, wildlife, and the environment. And due to this regulatory change, the amount of environmental data collected and submitted to the ECMC has gone up tremendously. ECMC rules and policies require oil and gas operators to collect and analyze background samples for groundwater and surface water. And the ECMC has been collecting background water samples since the early 2000s. Current ECMC rules also require the collection of produced water data. The ECMC does have older produced water data as well that was collected earlier during the PIT permit process. The current baseline sampling rule, Rule 615, is our statewide groundwater sampling and analysis, requires 4 samples to be collected within a half mile of oil and gas locations. The initial samples must be collected prior to the first well on the location being spud. The rule calls for pre-drill samples, 1-year post-completion samples, 5-year post-completion samples, then a sample every 5 years for the life of the well. And to wrap it all up, there's a post-closure sample once the last well on a location is plugged and abandoned. We also have Rule 805, 806 that requires samples of produced water that are injected into the underground injection wells. There's a requirement that those be sampled, and those are sort of the beginning of the produced water. And we also have Rule 909J that requires samples of produced water that is placed into pits. Unlined pits have an annual sampling requirement, and lined pits have a 5-year requirement. Samples will be collected for the lifetime of the pit. This is kind of a history of some of our sampling rules and commission orders that led to sampling. So as you can see, back in the 2000s, we had Commission Order 1112, 156, and 157. for sampling in coal bed methane wells. And we've added to that ever since in 2005, 318 AE, which was sampling in the GY area to the north of Denver. And then Rule 608 was all CBM statewide. And then in April 2009, the OGLA group got the authority to add requirements for sampling on a Form 2A location assessment form. And then in 2011, we added Rule 318A and 609, which was the GWA sampling rule and 609 sampling rule. And our most current rule is Rule 615, which expanded Rule 609 to truly be statewide with no exception for the GWA area. And so with all this sampling, we have to be able to keep control of the data that comes in. And so we do that by using an electronic form. So which is the Form 43 analytical data form. And that's used by operators to submit analytical data to the ECMC. The Form 43 analytical data form is required for the sampling of 615, 805, 806, 909J, and pretty much anything else that requires sampling. As part of the Form 43 submittal process, an electronic data deliverable, or EDD, is required to be attached to the form. An EDD is a data file or files in a specified format designed to transmit information electronically to another data user. The EDD submission process allows uniformity in the data provided to the ECMC, even though the data is provided from different operators and different laboratories, by requiring all EDDs meet specific valid value standards, such as analytical method names, analytical parameter names, and units of measure. The ECMC has two acceptable EDD formats. One is an Excel format, and the other is in XML, which is extensible markup language. EDDs submitted to the ECMC must be made by the laboratory that completed the analysis and generated directly from the laboratory data management system. This reduces the chance of errors being introduced in the EDD and ultimately reduces errors in the ECMC environmental database. I've included a link here to our help documents that will show what an EDD looks like. Once an EDD has been uploaded and parsed, which means the valid values have been checked electronically, and if there's any errors, the EDDs are kicked back to the operator and they must be fixed prior to the EDD being accepted. Once this has taken place, the Form 43 is submitted to ECMC staff for final review. The staff review consists of checking information such as, does the submitted sample information make sense? Does it reference the correct rule? Does the analytical information align with the rule the data was submitted for? This kind of provenance regarding the sample is almost as important as the analytical data itself. Once approved, the data is permanently stored in the ECMC environmental database. So that's kind of how we handle all our samples. And now I kind of wanted to look at Rule 909J specifically. Beginning in January 15th of 2021, operators are required to submit an initial water quality sample for produced water from each well which produces into a pit. And this is all pits. So this is including pits that were constructed prior to January 15th, 2021. No wells or pits were grandfathered in. And the water samples will be analyzed for pH, specific conductants, total dissolved and suspended solids, alkalinity, which includes total alkalinity, bicarbonate, and carbonate as calcium carbonate. Major anions include bromide, chloride, fluoride, sulfate, nitrate, nitrite, and phosphorus. Major cations of calcium, iron, magnesium, manganese, potassium, and sodium, and other elements such as barium, boron, selenium, and strontium. We also collect a number of organic chemicals, including naphthalene, TPH is total total petroleum hydrocarbons as total volatile hydrocarbons, which you could kind of think of like gasoline, falls within that range, and total extractable hydrocarbons, which is kind of like a diesel or light oil. And BTEX compounds that include benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. And radium-226 and 228. We have subsequent sampling and analysis after the initial sampling. Operators will collect and analyze subsequent samples at the following frequency. For line pits, operators will collect and analyze a second confirmation sample within about 36 months after the initial sampling and analysis. For unlined pits, operators will collect and analyze samples on an annual basis after the initial sampling and analysis is complete. If subsequent sampling and analysis indicates stable water quality over time, operators may request relief from subsequent sampling analysis by submitting a Form 4 to which the director or staff will review and approve or deny. For all pits, operators will collect and analyze a subsequent sample for any new well that contributes water to the pit. For all pits, operators will collect and analyze a subsequent sample anytime the operator or director has a reason to believe the water quality in the pit has changed. And also for all pits, if subsequent sampling analysis indicates variable water quality, the director may require more frequent or additional sampling. Operators will submit water quality analysis data using a Form 43, which I discussed earlier, and it will include the suitable electronic deliverable generated by the laboratory and a PDF of the lab report within 3 months of the sample collection. Results for the initial sample collected pursuant to Rule 909 J1 will be submitted no later than July 15th, 2022, or prior to pit closure. And we're still working with many operators to get in their samples. So we don't have all the samples we should have yet, but we're slowly getting everybody into compliance with the rule. I've also included a couple guidance documents here about how to collect the data or how the operator should sample and submit things. And you can take a look at that if you are interested. And there's a couple important notes about sample collection that I do want to highlight. Is if operators have the ability to collect a produced water sample directly from each well or from separation equipment that serves an individual well, then the operator will collect one sample per vent for each well. In cases where all wells flow multi-phase fluids, which means they may have water, gas, and oil combined, these fluids will go to a single separator at a central location. Then the operator will collect a produced water sample from the common separator or other shared separation equipment. But these should be upstream of the pit. If no other produced water sampling options are available, the operator will collect a produced water sample from the discharge pipe into the pit. Samples of standing or stagnant produced water already discharged to the pit are not acceptable for compliance with the rule. So all the data that we collect under our ECMC rules, including 909J, are made available through the COGIS map system, the COGIS database, through 2 additional access files. So I would attach a link to the file and you should end up on a screen that looks similar to what I show here on the right. And in order to find the analytical data, you'll want to go to the map and look to the left, and there's a whole series of layers on the map. You'll want to go down to environmental and make environmental active, and then select sample sites. The sample sites will show up on the map as the light green triangles. And if you select one of those triangles, it'll take you to a screen that looks similar to this. It has a little bit of information about the sample location. And it will show, as you can see here, it's got the API number for the well that this came from. And then down below, you can see the information for each sample that has been collected. That includes the sample ID. Every sample collected and submitted to the ECMC will have its own unique sample ID. And it'll also include the sample date, just the date the sample was collected, and the collection point. It really has the type of sample that was collected, and the lab that did the analysis. And to actually see the analytical data, you can select the triangle, the upside down triangle on the right side, and it will take you to a summary of the analytical data that was collected. You can also access the data through the COGIS database directly. In order to access the data through the COGIS database, select COGIS database through the quick links on the ECMC homepage or through the link that I've included below. In order to access, I already did that. So for your inquiry, you can select facility, sample site, and these are helpful if you want to, if you know exactly the site you want to see, you can just enter the number and select it. If you're doing more of a general search, you can select by something, say like I did media type here. So you just select gas and produced water, and it will return a list of wells. These are generally going to return CBM wells. So they produce gas, a considerable amount of water. So you can see we get a list of wells that have samples. And if you select one of those, it will take you back to the same screen as I showed before, where you can see the sample point location on the left. And then when you select the triangle, the upside down triangles, it will return, or you can see your analytical data that was collected. Now that's kind of a slow process if you want to see a lot of data. And so we also do provide 2 data downloads that are, they're both in Access database format. The first one is the, we have it as the analytical sample data, and that's really the water well data, such as we collect for Rule 615. There's an oil and gas well analysis database as well. And this is probably where you're going to find most of the produced water data. And so in the Access database is set up so it should be fairly straightforward for a relational database. There's really 3 tables in it. There's one table contains location information, one table contains sample information, and the third table contains the result information. And these all relate to one another. And so it's possible to just do basic queries, and it's kind of an example of the results of one. And in this particular one that I have in the database, it just has facility ID, API number, latitude, longitude of the well, date of the samples, the laboratory ID number, the matrix, what kind of sample it is, and then the results. So that's most of my presentation I have for you today, but there is a couple takeaways I would like the commission to hear about. It's through the ECMC Form 43 and ED process. The ECMC has a large data set of produced water data that can be relied on because of the data uniformity in the review process that's already been done. The data is available and can be leveraged immediately to begin the process of determining how produced water can be reused or recycled, both inside and outside of the oil field. And I think this is also kind of important, is that the ECMC data should be thought of as a starting point. Additional analytes will likely will be needed in order to make recommendations specific to reuse and recycling. There are a couple limitations that I thought of with the data while I was listening earlier. some of the limitations we'll need to take into consideration is that the analytical data that we have collected is specific to pits. And so I don't have an analytical sample from every oil and gas well that produces water. It's really only water that goes to pits, but is still very useful. And also, it was not intentionally collected to be used for reuse and recycling, but I do think you can use it as a starting point. And I think that's all I have for my presentation. Is there any questions?
Thanks, Arthur. That was super helpful, and appreciate the information that you provided. You've got a number of questions that are jumping up here. So
Okay.
I think first hand I saw was Tessa. So Tessa, you want to ask your question?
Sure. I actually had a quick question and then another question. The quick question is, you talked about relief from having to sample and how they could petition for that year after year. What are the factors that go into that sort of granting that sort of relief? Is it just a matter of water quality, or is it also a matter of surrounding population, proximity, things like that? That's my first question.
Well, nobody's asked. Nobody's asked for relief yet. But since that's probably going to come to me to review, I would say yes, populations, things, it will be water quality, but we will look at other things like that. The surrounding population, is it a reasonable request? So as I said, nobody's asked yet, so nobody's gotten one approved.
Well, that's great to know. The second question I had was, you talked about getting samples of the produced water that comes out of the wells, regardless of whether it's commingled from multiple wells or not. What's the frequency of that sampling? Is it one and done? Is it regular over that? I might have missed that in your presentation, but I know that as the reservoir depletes, the character of the water that comes out of it definitely can change.
Yes, and right now it's dependent on the pit that the water goes into. For unlined pits, so just simple earthen pits, they have to collect samples every year. And for lined pits, it's like 2 initial samples and then every 5 years after that, unless we see something we think we need more samples of.
But if it's not going to a pit and it's just standard produced water, the qualities of that water is not actually tracked on a consistent basis?
Correct. We don't have samples. That is one of the limitations of the data that I have, is it is related to the pits. We also do have some data. Rule 805 and 806 that deal with UIC wells, they are required to sample for the same analytical parameters as 909J. So we are getting more, but that can be kind of more mixed. It's not as much on a well-to-well basis because it is a sample of the injectate that's going into the well.
So it sounds like we don't really have great public data for produced water quality itself as it comes out of the well across just kind of over basin wide.
That's probably correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Barbara?
Yeah, thanks, John. I have a couple questions. So when we look at pits and the use of pits, is that primarily older vertical wells as opposed to horizontal wells that you're sampling from?
Generally correct, yes.
Okay, so not representative in general to wells that are fracked.
Well, the vertical wells can be fracked as well, but say like in the DJ Basin where it is mainly horizontal wells now, new wells, very few new wells use pits to dispose of their water.
Thanks for that. And the drinking water aquifer half-mile sampling, my understanding here in the rural county I live in is you have to have a willing owner of the well.
Correct.
Within half a mile to generate the sample.
Right.
Okay.
We cannot compel water well owners to allow the operators to sample.
Right. Right, and no way is ECMC going to drill their own well to monitor what's happening to that aquifer at this point.
Probably not at this time, no.
It was a rhetorical, really wasn't a question. And then the final question, Arthur, and thank you very much for this presentation. So we have this data grave, if you will. I didn't hear anything about actions that are taken based on levels in either the water sampled from water wells or the water in the pits. For example, if it was a very high concentration of BTEX and volatiles, would you get them to shut down the use of that pit?
It depends on the pit. In the past, we've allowed them to, they should not be having oil or other hydrocarbons on the surface. And we have this discussion internally about what we're going to do with some of these pits that have been around forever and have been allowed to produce into, the operators have produced into these pits for 20 years. How do we get this, get it done so we can clean it up if their water quality is not of high enough quality or really shouldn't be discharged into a pit. And as far as like water samples, we do review them. When we do the review of the samples that we get under 615, operators are required to notify us through a separate process if they come across BTEX, or more commonly it's methane is the contaminant that we find, and that we find thermogenic methane on occasion in water wells. And if operators do find BTEX, TPH, or TEPH, or thermogenic methane, they do need to report it to us. And we also, when I do the review, I've always scanned through all the data that I get, and I look for those things specifically. And if we do come across those, we do initiate an investigation into the source.
And then what happens? We
Well,
have the data and you do an investigation, then what happens?
Well, we go back to the operator, and if necessary, we'll have them collect more samples, like try and get more water well samples from around where we found whatever the contaminant is. We'll conduct more sampling and also direct the operator to conduct their own investigations as to why, I shouldn't say the operators in the surrounding area to conduct a review of their wells, and try and determine the source of the wells, or the source of the contamination. And if we do find a problem with the well, it's generally the operator will have to either either plug and abandon the well or repair the well. And if we can pinpoint the well, generally the operator will be held responsible for providing water, another water source for the affected water well owner.
And Kevin Chen put into the chat, are these investigation reports open to the public?
Yes. You can usually the investigation report will start as a Form 19. You can either find it under the Form 19 or the Form 27.
Okay, I think next question is Peter McMahon.
Hi, Arthur. Thanks. That was a really informative presentation. I had two questions about your groundwater sampling, but I think you answered the first one when you responded to the last speaker's question about whether or not you would require operators to install monitoring wells to sample groundwater if there weren't any existing wells. It sounds like that doesn't happen. So I understand that. So my second question has to do with situations where there might be more than one aquifer in a location. So for example, if there's an alluvial aquifer overlying a bedrock aquifer, is there any requirement to collect samples from both aquifers, or is that left to the producer to decide?
It is the goal within the rule, or at least in the guidance we've provided, is that if you have the option to collect from multiple aquifers, that is the preference. So if you do have the alluvial aquifer and you can get access to that, that should be collected, as well as the deeper aquifers as you can. The goal is really to get water from as many potential receptors of contamination as you can.
Great, thanks for that clarification.
Commissioner Pinner?
Yep, thank you. I had a couple questions that were follow-ups to the series of questions that you were answering, I believe, from Tessa at the beginning. When you were talking about relief from sampling, you had said that one, no one has applied for relief from sampling yet. Additionally, that it would be your discretion, the factors included. And I'm kind of curious, are there any governing documents in 909J or other places that would inform your discretion if someone were to apply for relief?
The only thing that we really have is that it says that the data, the analytical data has to show that the water is consistent. So you have very similar results over the course of the time that has been sampled so far.
Okay. So the only written guidance is that the water is consistent.
Yes.
Thanks. In looking at the sampling that's currently done that goes into the water that might end up in a pit, you were looking through a number of water quality analysis items, and looking through that list, I would be curious either, Arthur, if you have any ideas, or to the scientists in our group, are there any items, and we could pull that slide back up, I think it's like 6 or 8 back, that lists like everything down to radium that is missing from this list that we should be paying attention to? Or do any of the scientists in this group have any ideas? And I hate to like bridge. There we go, this one, thank you. That we should be paying attention to as we're discussing produced water. And if Arthur, you don't have any ideas or don't feel like it's your role.
Oh, sorry.
I can just, we can hold that.
Are you looking for additional analytes? Is that kind of?
Yeah, is there, you know, as not a chemist, I'm just kind of curious, you know, or geologist, is there anything that you wish was on this list?
Yeah, Emma, James Rosenblum here, School of Mines. I mean, the answer is yes, right? You capture a pretty good swath of the inorganics here. And from a hydrocarbon perspective, you capture the low molecular weight to the high molecular weight with some of the, you know, TPH, and at least you get one PAH in naphthalene. It would be nice to maybe see some other semi-volatile organic compounds, which would capture a wider range of kind of different masses of the hydrocarbons, to the non-volatile things like surfactants. The problem with that is that there's an MBAS method. There isn't a great analytical method for surfactants yet for things we see in produced water. I think this is a good place to start. It does capture norm, which, you know, sometimes some produced water analysis doesn't capture norm. So you capture norm, you capture a bulk of the inorganics, and you capture a snapshot of the hydrocarbons. I think the hydrocarbons could be expanded a bit, but I think this is a pretty good list to start. It'd just be some of the non-volatile things that, you know, would be nice to expand upon.
As I kind of said in the presentation, I think this is the place to start.
Yeah, and I really, and I think it's a good place to start. I think this there's a lot covered in here that really captures a lot of the constituents that would be of concern, or things that would be indicators for other potential contaminants. So I think it is a really good place to start.
Okay, thank you. I did have another question, and this is something that as an elected official and sort of sitting in that bridge between community and industry and regulating in my own community, one of the questions that I get all the time, because there can be a real breakdown in trust, what is the capacity for sampled water results to be faked? And what controls are in place to ensure that the other than, coming from the lab directly, and you spoke a little bit about the results have to come through the lab, not a third party. Can you talk a little bit more about sampling controls to build that community trust?
Well, a lot of the trust comes from that, we do look at this all the time, and it is difficult. I don't want to say it's difficult to fake. I guess it could be faked, but I don't think it's going to go well for an operator if we figure out they're faking their samples. I think we would have I think our enforcement group would kind of have a field day with that. Because we do have rules, we do have rules in place that, everything that is submitted to the ECMC is true and factual. And so if we can show that it's what they submitted was not really what was there, that would, I don't remember the exact rule that it's under, but we could enforce on that.
What does enforcement mean? Is it a fine? Is it
It would be a fine.
10-day
Most likely a fine.
A $50 fine, a $100 fine, a $100,000 fine? What kind of fine?
It really depends on the infraction. So I don't work in the enforcement group, so I could not say exactly what that one could be.
So I can help a little bit on this with Emma. I mean, certainly, I think what Arthur's talking about initially in this conversation is the requirement for third-party verification or third-party testing associated with this. And then, additional verification of that analysis by ECMC staff. And so, I mean, that's the check and balance that occurs now. I mean, as you're aware, anything, anyone can try to cheat on anything, right? And so I do think that there's, certainly attempts for checks and balances there, and that's what's available in the rules right now. But I think there's certainly, discussions we can have if folks have better ideas or other thoughts on that we can have, further along in our meetings. And from an enforcement standpoint, as Arthur indicated, we've got a range of tools that are available to the enforcement team as far as implementing enforcement, and some of that has to do with the severity of it, right? And so there's a matrix and dozens of pages of guidance in our enforcement documents that indicates how it's addressed, and penalties can go all the way up to revoking an operator's certificates to be able to operate in the state of Colorado, down to a fine based on the number of days that violation occurred. And so, yeah, I mean, it's going to range depending on the severity of the infraction, and so I'd say it starts at a few $1,000s and goes up to $18 million or revocation of their certificates of clearance. So it depends on that, and it depends on the application of the enforcement matrix as to how those enforcement protocols get developed or administered. So
okay, thank you. That's really
we could have a couple-hour presentation on the enforcement process as well, because it's pretty elaborate. So
I imagine there's thresholds. I do have one last question. I am a little concerned for the unlined pits. You had said the testing was annually. 12 months feels like a long time to wait if one of the items on this list is starting to be present in the water. In an unlined pit, 12 months feels long. So I'm sure this group will be having a conversation about how frequently we want the testing and costs and effectiveness. You also had talked a little bit about how the produced material that other than water can sometimes change the mix of what's in the produced water, and that depending on oil or gas and what's coming up, and again, not a geologist, so I apologize for my or thank you for understanding my human language here, but like what comes up is either oil or gas, and depending on that mix, there might be different things showing up in the water. And I just feel like if you have any comments, Arthur, on how frequently that mix changes and how that relates to the 12-month sampling for an unlined pit.
Well, with the different phases, really, we have separators. There's separators out in the oil and gas fields that will separate gas from water or oil from water, or separate the three of them. And so in areas where it's say like the coal bed methane production, all you have generally is gas and water. So the gas is separated from the water, and the water goes into is disposed of in the pit, or however else they dispose of it. And then obviously when there's oil, you then have quite a few more analytes or chemical constituents that come up with the oil as well. The hydrocarbon, more hydrocarbon rich your produced water is liable to be. And there's separators should be set up to knock that out or take that out prior to the water going into the pit. Does that kind of help?
It does, and I should have been a little more specific. Does your monitoring change? Or do you have the capacity to change the frequency of monitoring depending on what is coming up with the produced water?
We do have some ability to increase the monitoring. If we feel it's necessary, we can ask operators to sample at a more frequent basis.
Okay. Thank you. Those are my questions.
So I hate to do this because I know we've got a couple more questions, but we're already 5 minutes over on this particular topic. And I think the next topic, which is water rights stuff, is also going to have a ton of questions. So I note that Clay, you've got a question. Peter, you've got a question. If you want to put those questions in chat, offline, we can have Arthur answer those questions to you, and we can email them out to the group after the meeting, or if there happens to be additional time at the end of the meeting, we can get to that. But I do want to make sure that we're able to get on to this next topic, so apologize in advance for that. So thanks, Arthur. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Great questions. I always hate to cut off questions. I wish we could schedule more time. So in the future, we'll certainly schedule more times for questions, and I think that is something that we should do anyway. So, but with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tracy for all things water rights.
Thanks, Commissioner Messner. I think I need Arthur's presentation down so I can share my screen.
I think he's on that.
I've tried to, I guess I'll just, as a preamble, say, sometimes people get kind of scared when we say we're going to talk about Colorado water rights, because people do have the correct understanding that it can get very complicated, but the basic premises are actually quite simple. And so, I'm going to try to avoid some of the real complexities that don't probably matter to you all, and just try to keep it simple about what you all might need to know for this work we're doing as the consortium. So here comes my slide. Is that all right, folks?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Here we go. So Colorado's Constitution tells us that the water of natural streams is the property of the people of Colorado. It also tells us that the priority of use of that water, when there isn't enough for all of the uses, is based on older, more senior uses getting the first chance to use water. This is what we call the priority system, or prior appropriation. A person might obtain a right to use the public's water, and then the water court system confirms that priority date, the seniority within our system of the water right. So you got to go to the water court to say, confirm that my priority date is 1884, whatever it might be. Here's the system visually. When there isn't enough water supply for all uses, only the most senior get to divert the water. Others must let it flow by without using it. So in this really simple picture, we've got the senior user, 1910, and the junior water user, 1970. So when there's not enough for both of them, 1970 needs to shut off, can't take the water, and the water needs to flow to the senior. By statute, it's the state engineer and the state engineer's staff who have the authority and the duty to direct the use of water according to the priority system. and the other laws that govern water use in Colorado. So the state engineer staff, those staff on the ground, they're called water commissioners, and here's one or two of them in our photo. Their job is to go out and shut down those junior water users when there's not enough for everybody. So this is a water commissioner doing his job. He's shutting someone off so that water can go to the seniors. I know we have a lot of interest in environmental issues here on the consortium, so I did want to describe that there is a way to consider flows of water for environmental uses within the priority system. These are called in-stream flow water rights. They do fit within the priority system, but our laws didn't actually recognize an environmental type of beneficial use until 1973. Since many of our water rights date back to the 1800s, these environmental uses, since they weren't allowed till 1973, they're usually pretty junior. And so in times of scarcity, even though there might be an in-stream flow water right on a particular stream system, it's not very likely to be in priority. These senior water rights are most likely taking water even when there is an in-stream flow water use. So that's a big generalization. It doesn't always hold true, but it's definitely true that in-stream flow uses tend to be pretty junior. It's also true that a senior water right oftentimes has the lawful right to divert the entire stream. So we do have lots of places around the state where we have a senior water user who's going to take all of the water out of the stream. It's worth noting, because I think that it can be confusing, that there are two agencies with authority around water within Colorado's Department of Natural Resources. We've got the CWCB, which is the water planning and funding arm of DNR. And then we've got the Division of Water Resources, which is also called the State Engineer's Office. The state engineer is the director. And the state engineer's office, like I already said, its authority and duty is around directing the system of water use. And, you know, to make it even more complicated, we have another agency with water authority, and that's the Water Quality Control Division, which is within the Department of Public Health and the Environment. So if it feels kind of confusing, well, you know, it is a little confusing, but that's kind of where our authorities lie along the water spectrum. All right, so switching gears a little bit to talk about water volumes and location. It's worth spending a moment to talk about the units we use to measure water. We can all imagine the size of a 5-gallon bucket, or one of those 55-gallon rain barrels that some people have on their downspouts and they use to water their lawns. But the energy industry, they report water amounts in barrels, and the water world uses a term called acre feet. And it's sometimes just really confusing to keep these straight or have a good mental picture about what this means. So an acre foot is exactly as it sounds. It's covering an acre of land with 1 foot of water. And so because I'm going to talk, and a lot of other water people talk in terms of acre feet, you know, how much might that really be? So an acre foot, it's about 8,000 gallons. It's also, sorry, I misspoke there. An acre foot is about 8,000 barrels. It's 325,000 gallons of water. You know, well, what does that even mean? It's just such a large number. So I looked up the data for Castle Rock because it was just really easy to find online how much water the residents of Castle Rock use. So the average Castle Rock home uses about 100,000 gallons per year, so 1/3 of an acre foot. An acre of crop irrigation in Colorado might require about 3 acre-feet of water. And sometimes I hear in the media talking about, well, this is like 1 billion gallons of water is going to go here or there, and 1 billion always just sounds like such a large amount of water. But when we're looking at the scale of the amount of water that flows through our river basins here in Colorado, 1 billion gallons, that's equal to 3,000 acre-feet. That's enough water to irrigate about 1,000 acres of land in Colorado. And again, I'm making some really big generalizations that don't always hold true, but they're pretty good rules of thumb. So 1 billion gallons of water, although it sounds like a lot, it's not going to be that much in the scale of, let's say, the flow of the Colorado River. Trying to see, what else did I want to say about this? So 1 billion gallons of water, this would also be enough for about 10,000 homes in Castle Rock for a year. So that's less than half of the homes in Castle Rock. So moving along, it seemed important to go through that explanation of acre feet before I show this slide with the amount of water that flows out of our state in units of acre feet. So there's 4.5 million acre feet on average that flow in the Colorado River out of our state. So 4.5 million acre feet, that would be, billions and billions of gallons of water. Another thing that, if you didn't take much out of my talk today, one thing I'd really like to stress is that when we're talking about water, location within Colorado is just super important because areas of our state are so different in terms of water supply and water demand. I can't really stress that enough. I think it's really relevant to the work the consortium is doing too and what our goals are. So we can generally say that Colorado for water has this 80-20 split. 80% of the water supply falls on our west slope, 20% on the east slope. And yet our demands for water are really switched because most of our population and most of our irrigated lands are in the east slope. So, that's just, I guess, a challenge in our water world that we are dealing with. So again, more on the numbers. This is a table that comes out of this report that my agency, DWR, did in conjunction with OGCC a couple years back. OGCC, the previous name of ECMC. There was a lot of interest around, well, how much water are we really using in Colorado for hydraulic fracturing? It seems like a lot. We see a lot of water trucks driving around. How much water is really being used? And so this table is getting at just that. How much water are we using in Colorado for all of our uses? And how much are we using for hydraulic fracturing? So this report was put out in 2021. It's a little bit dated, but I would think that the general scope of what we're talking about certainly holds true. And so in Colorado, on an average year, we're going to divert about 15 million acre feet of water for all of our various uses of water. Most of those diversions are for agricultural purposes. 85% on average of our diversions are for agricultural purposes. Municipal is our second biggest use. That's at about 6%. And then, we're kind of can go down the table from there, but I have marked here the row for hydraulic fracturing. This is 26,000 acre feet per year. So it's less than 1% of our diversions for all of our uses, less than 1% for hydraulic fracturing. So 26,000 acre feet a year. I mean, certainly it would be good to get updated numbers, and it was helpful to understand from Greg earlier today, you know, about the data that ECMC is collecting and working on getting more information. So I think along with the data that the consortium is going to look at, it'll be good to update this. But I think it gives us a good idea of kind of the scale of where we are. And I just grabbed this screenshot out of Greg's slideshow to show that this number in the table, this 26,000 acre feet, this would be the sum of freshwater used and recycled water used. And this was coming from self-reported data from the operators for the period before the year 2020. So this is both fresh and recycled water in this number here. This seemed to me like the right time to bring up the consortium's primary goal from our website. And I asked Greg about this earlier, but the primary goal of the consortium: reduce the use of fresh water, increase the recycling of produced water. So again, we're talking about two different things: the use of fresh water, how much fresh water is going down the hole. And that was what was, this is fresh and recycled water going down the hole. And increase the recycling of produced water. So, you know, what's coming up the hole. And I don't have any, I don't have numbers around that. Again, looking at Greg's tables, just breaking up our goal into those different columns in his tables. But I did break down that 26,000 acre feet per year number based on this data that is 2020 and earlier. So it's dated. But when I mentioned earlier, I think location is really important for the consortium to look at. I was surprised to see how much the water use for hydraulic fracturing was concentrated in just a couple of counties. And maybe you all in the oil and gas industry are not at all surprised about this, but I was surprised that, where are we? Let's see, if we dig into that 26,000 acre feet diversion number, both recycled and fresh, Weld County's got the greatest water use reported, about 80% of the total, and then Garfield's about 13%. And then if you look at the chart on the left side, you can see that water use really varied greatly between about 2010 and 2020 year to year. And maybe that's just typical for the industry, I don't know. So, you know, the consortium is tasked with looking at both reducing the amount of water going down the holes and also increasing the use of recycled water. And I think in both these halves of the equation, we really then need to look at the landscape of, well, where is most of this water use occurring? And then where is this produced water available for recycling or for other uses? And then we have to ask ourselves, well, what are the needs of other water users in these areas? And does the consortium really want to focus on location if most of the water use is really limited to just a couple of counties? At least it seems like if this trend continues and, you know, if newer data continues to show that location is concentrated in one place or just a couple of places, it seems like there can certainly be a bigger bang for the buck, because we're not looking at all of Colorado, like we're really looking at some concentrated locations. And maybe the last thing I would say on this slide is is that even though that 26,000 acre feet total number doesn't break out fresh or recycled sources of water for hydraulic fracturing, the data that was provided from OGCC back in 2021, it did have that information, and it showed that in Weld County, 82% of that water for hydraulic fracturing was fresh water. And then in Garfield County, which was where the county with the second most water used for hydraulic fracturing, only 6% of that water was fresh water, meaning that most of their water there was already recycled. So again, it just, in my mind, and if this data continues, we need to, see what the new data says. Well, Weld County is using the most, and they're also using mostly fresh water. So again, I think the consortium will want to see, what does ECMC's more recent data show, but it might be really interesting and really point us to good places to focus our attention if these kind of trends continue. All right, so let me switch gears yet again, get back to some more Colorado water law discussion that we haven't covered yet, and that's groundwater. Groundwater use has some slight differences compared to the priority system information I already talked about. So much of Colorado's groundwater use, such as the big center pivot sprinklers that you see on irrigated agriculture, they're pulling groundwater out of alluvial aquifers. Alluvial aquifers, that's where water fills the spaces between the grains of sand and cobbles that have accumulated along the paths of streams as they've meandered over the land. This is groundwater that's in close connection with the stream system. Typically, the groundwater table slopes down toward the stream, providing a steady inflow to our stream system. So groundwater, in most cases, is connected to surface water. So if you pump a well in Colorado, the assumption is that it will cause a reduction in stream flow, like you can see here in the figure. The reduction in stream flow is called a depletion. When a well is pumped, it might take time, it might take days or months to actually fully impact the stream system because there's a travel time through that alluvial aquifer before the well's pumping pulls the water out of the stream. As we've talked about, Colorado's oldest water rights, they date back to the mid-1800s. But the technology to pump large amounts of water from wells wasn't widely available until the 1950s. So wells, they can have a priority date within the priority system, but they tend to be pretty junior because this technology just wasn't available till the 1950s. So thinking about our priority system in times of shortage, wells shouldn't be able to pump. They should be shut off so that the senior water rights can get their full amount of water. Well, in most cases, we're not going to shut off those big irrigation wells, but they do need to operate within the priority system. So junior wells and junior water users, they do have a method to continue to use water even when their priority date is junior, and they should not be able to pump according to simply their priority date. And this is called a plan for augmentation. Plan for augmentation allows a junior water user to continue to operate even when there's not enough water for all the seniors. So what happens is you can get this plan for augmentation. It allows you to continue to pump even though you're junior. But what you need to do in that plan for augmentation is find another source of water that provides water upstream of the senior water users. We call that augmentation water. So as long as you provide enough water to keep the senior water user whole, then the junior water user can continue to pump. So I want the consortium to be aware when we're thinking about, recycling produced water, we might be thinking, oh, maybe we can recycle that not only in the oil field, but for irrigation or for some other types of water use. Augmentation is another potential way that produced water could be used. It's not a normal use of water. It actually just allows uses of water because it allows junior water users to continue to operate. So I just want you to be aware of this other type of water use called augmentation, which just really facilitates junior water users to continue doing what they're doing. Let me make sure. Okay. So well permits and groundwater rights are two different things, but they are related. It's worth bringing up because I think the consortium needs to think about barriers to reusing produced water, including the different types of regulatory hoops that producers need to go through. In most cases, a well permit is needed from the Division of Water Resources to use groundwater. You don't always need a water right to use groundwater, because if you're just going to be junior and need to augment your use, your junior priority date is not really that important if you're always going to have to put augmentation water in the stream system. So, but you almost always are going to need a well permit from the Division of Water Resources. So in contrast to tributary groundwater, which is connected to streams, there's another type of groundwater that is disconnected from streams. In this picture here, we've got a deep oil and gas well, and it's producing water from a formation that's probably disconnected from streams. Non-tributary groundwater does not need to consider the priority system because it's not impacting the streams at all. And so that water, it can be used without consideration of its priority date, and it doesn't need to augment. There's a set of rules that direct a process for determining which produced water formations are non-tributary. There's special produced non-tributary groundwater rules. And much of the state's already been mapped to identify produced non-tributary formations. The map of these non-tributary formations is available on DWR's website on our mapping tool. It's called the Map Viewer. And you can see, so all these colored blotches, they do cover a great deal of the state, and they are like overlapping in different depths. So as I mentioned before, usually a well permit's required for groundwater use. That includes when produced water is going to be used for beneficial. That includes when produced water is going to be used for beneficial use. So the need for a well permit from DWR to use water is one of the regulatory requirements the consortium should be aware of. But the purple text that I've highlighted here is an easier path because we have a statutory exemption when a well permit's not needed. That's when produced water is not coming from a coal bed methane well, when it's non-tributary, and when the use is going to be within the oil and gas operations. So that's a lot of, check boxes that have to be checked to avoid this well permitting requirement. But it's just maybe worth highlighting that there's an easier regulatory path for produced water that's not from coal bed methane, that's from a non-tributary source, and that's just being reused within the oil and gas operations. Now, is it that difficult and onerous to get a DWR well permit? I mean, not necessarily. It's certainly doable, but I just want to highlight for you all kind of the easy path here. And so here's just a slide with some of my thoughts as I was putting this together for you all and thinking about what the consortium needs to do. I'd say at the high level, I think location is really important for our work. Where are these oil and gas wells, and what are the needs for water in these areas? I think, you know, since I'm saying location is so important, the flip side of that is that it may be hard for us as a consortium to make broad conclusions about reducing freshwater use and increasing recycling that hold true in every corner of the state, because things can be so variable geographically. But I'm just going to go through these really briefly, and it's my last slide as well. So, you know, when we're talking about reducing the amount of fresh water, when we think about, you know, reducing water use in our municipalities, we think about replacing our toilets and taking shorter showers. And I don't know if it's possible for the industry just to use less and doing what they're doing. Perhaps not. I'm not an expert. But in the water sector, we think about, well, can we just reduce the demand? Can we just turn down the demand side and we don't need to have as much supply? Can more water be recycled within the oil field? From a well permitting perspective, like I was saying on my last slide, well, that's less onerous from a well permitting perspective. Updated water use data. Greg already told me, you know, that's in the works, and I wouldn't want us to rely on the data I showed that's 2020 and before. But, you know, I just think it'll be important for the consortium to look at that. If not recycled in the oil field, is water quality for direct use and irrigation reasonable? When I showed that table, irrigation uses 86% of our water in Colorado, and a lot of that is occurring in the Weld County area. So again, from a water quality perspective, I'm not sure, but I think we might want to talk about that. Is water quality for stream discharge for augmentation use reasonable? Again, in that Weld County area in the South Platte Basin, there is a need for augmentation water, but I don't know if the quality is appropriate to discharge to our stream systems. And I guess, like I've stressed already, location's important. What are the needs for water use near where the oil wells are producing water? What kind of needs are in that particular area? So with that, I'll stop. I see some questions.
Thanks, Tracy. Great presentation. Lots of questions coming up. So I'll start with Brandy.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. That was a great presentation. Brandy Honeycutt with the Water Quality Control Division. As most of you know, I work on our recycled water program, and my understanding is there's a kind of a whole other chapter to reusable water rights in Colorado. So like if you want to reclaim wastewater and reuse it, that water has to have been sourced from a different basin. Right, Tracy? Like, for example, like Lake Dillon water at Denver Water can be reused to extinction down here, but the South Platte water cannot. Is that an accurate way to say that?
Yeah, good question. Good question, Brandy. So I would just flip what you said. So water that comes across like transcontinental water that's coming from the west slope to the east slope by nature can be reused to extinction. Now, if you had water source from the east slope, can it be reused on the east slope? The answer to that is it depends. So, you know, it depends on what the water right allows for. You know, non-tributary water is quite similar to that trans mountain water because both those types of water are not native to that stream system. So its use can be pretty flexible. So sort of the reusability of water usually gets at, it depends. It really depends on the specifics of where that water is coming from.
Thank you, Tracy.
Irene?
Hi, Irene Andrews speaking. Thank you, Tracy. That was really, really great. Couple of questions. Well, one thing I wanted to point out is that the way the bill is written, 1242, it does in a couple places specify the DJ basin has to have special emphasis. So it actually is written into the bill. then also, has it been determined who owns the non-tributary order that comes up from the drilling?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ownership, I guess, is a funny question to me. One of the things I started off with was that the water is the water of the people in Colorado, and you get a right to use it. I would say produced non-tributary water, in my mind, is in a bit of a funny spot. There's buying and selling of water all over Colorado. And I guess from a water rights perspective, I don't see any real concern with a transfer of ownership of an oil and gas company that's produced water and selling that, or somehow conveying the use of that water to another entity. It seems to have been something that's come up, I think, around the country, more in the oil and gas circles, I guess, than in the water circles. But from a water rights perspective, I don't really see any concern with, conveying produced water from the energy company that brought it up out of the ground and wants to use it for some other use and maybe convey it to another party for that use.
Okay, and then like when I get my water bill, it's a graduated scale. The more I use, the more I have to pay per gallon. Does that exist for the work that you're wearing? No, it doesn't?
Well, I mean, that's common in municipal systems, but in terms of what we're talking about for the consortium, I don't think it's going to really play into our discussions.
Okay. And then you is there any discussion on subsidence where, the ground is going down because the water is being removed?
I don't know if maybe others would be better to answer that question.
Okay.
Sorry, it's not something that I'm really versed in.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mike?
I might be able to answer that question about subsidence if you want, Chair Messner.
Sure.
Typically, you only see a lot of ground level subsidence when you're at a somewhat shallow depth. With that, if you're producing oil and gas and water, you have to be at kind of really close to kind of the aquifer level before you see subsidence at that scale on the surface. Most of the water in the DJs, it's all being produced at like 8,000 feet. I would be surprised if we saw significant subsidence there. Certainly possible, but I wouldn't say it'd be significant.
I've got a few more questions here. Mike?
Thanks, John, and thanks, Tracy. This was a really, really helpful, great presentation. I just had one kind of question about your slide regarding when permits are required or not required for non-tributary groundwater, just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. I took from that, yeah, that's the slide where for non-coal bed methane, there's no well permit required if it's both non-tributary and the water is being used to support oil and gas operations. So are we talking about there's not being a well permit required for the produced water that comes up, or can an operator say drill a water well specifically to source its fracking water, and it doesn't need a permit to get that? Is that what the law says, or are we just talking specifically about produced water here?
For produced water. So
just for produced water, okay.
Yeah, so it may seem a little funny, like they've already gotten a well permit from ECMC for their oil and gas operation. And then unless they fall within this kind of purple text here, they'll also need a well permit to, let's say, use that produced water outside of the oil field from DWR.
Okay. Yeah, all right, thank you.
Barbara?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Messner. Tracy, I want to underscore the comment you made several times through your presentation about we need to wait till we have the new data to make some conclusions about geography. For example, Jackson County, I know Aaron Light has had a terrible time in getting data from the main operator here on the amount of water used for drilling and fracking. And there's a big question whether the data is even accurate that has been provided. So I think this Form 7 that we heard about is the expanded data collection is really going to help us understand what that geography looks like. And the other comment I wanted to make, I think we really need some clarification on either regulation or legislation on the right to trade or sell produced water, an important reduction in barrier for transfer of produced water to midstream water companies or other operators. And if there's a confusion or a question there, it might be a barrier for individual operators to actually engage in that kind of commerce.
Yeah, I guess I've heard that statement before as well, more from the industry, and I don't really understand why it's problematic, but you know, maybe operators have kind of run into problems of that in the future. I guess I just ask that we really understand that that is a problem before we try to find a solution. And maybe it is. I may not be aware.
Jeff?
Thank you, Chair, and Jeff Kirtland. And just a couple comments. I think you know, the question that Irene asked and some of the comments that Barbara have made are you know, right on in terms of our understanding of this process. And from a practical you know, operator's perspective, you know, this question of ownership produced water. You know, from that perspective, you know, the rules identify that produced water is treated as an E&P waste. And so you know, the slide here that identifies that no well permit is needed, that essentially that produced water is treated as an E&P waste. And so it's really the obligation and responsibility of that operator to treat and essentially dispose of that E&P waste per the rules. Beyond that, you know, what the rules allow for is an ability to utilize water sharing agreements. I think we've talked about this, and I think that would be a good topic to wade into a little more with regard to opportunities. But you know, the practice has been that operators that share water between other operations, there's no value there. That is outlined in an operator's waste management plan that is part of the permit or the oil and gas development plan that's submitted for approval by the ECMC. So there's a lot of work that goes into how produced water is produced, managed by rule, tested as we heard about today, and analyzed. And then the rules expand on the opportunities to share that water with other operators. But obviously there's lots of constraints, as Tracy so eloquently has discussed here, in some of the location challenges that we have. But I just wanted to weigh in a little bit from an operator's perspective on how we've sort of managed and what those expectations are with respect to that produced water as an E&P waste. Thank you.
Clay? Oh, Clay, you're muted.
Thank you so much. Tracy, just a quick question relative to your almost your last slide where you talked about other uses for produced water in terms of reaching our ultimate goals and objectives as consortium. It relates kind of to that same point and what was just asked around produced water being designated as E&P waste. And my question is simply, if an operator wanted to use produced water for augmentation purposes, either directly or for, some in a commercial arrangement with someone else. Are there EWR constraints right now in the water quality that would be required in order to use it for augmentation purposes, whether that be for, for stream enhancement or aquifer enhancement?
Yeah, and so in that situation, you'd be, I think, discharging water directly to the stream, probably in most cases. And so you'd need a CDPHE discharge permit that would allow that. So that would be the Water Quality Control Division. And, this flow chart here on the screen, this is just like a draft, but there can be a complex number of requirements from different agencies in order to do such an operation, like a water quality discharge permit and then a GWR well permit for that type of use. So, it can get complicated.
Well, thank you. And I asked the question almost rhetorically because it serves to generate or reinforce the idea that you just stated, that the process currently is fairly complex. And simply as a statement to the fact that it presents multiple roadblocks that we currently have around the incentives to use produced water for other things. And interagency cooperation is going to be critical to making any substantive changes in this direction. And I'll just throw this out for comment and we can discuss it later. But one of the issues around it is being an EMP waste. Are there ways to consider changing that designation through water treatment and the plan for reuse of that water at other sources? And I know you aren't prepared to answer that today. I'm just throwing it out as a ultimate objective, because we have to do something to reduce the amount of complexity in terms of both interagency utilization and rules that govern various uses of produced water in order to make substantive change.
I think you make a good point. I guess we could probably talk about that all day.
Sure. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Clay. Appreciate the questions. I have a question, Tracy. Just so I'm better understanding. So non-tributary water, right? So I mean, I understand the non-tributary water that's produced water, water that comes out as part of oil and gas activities, utilized in oil and gas activities, doesn't appear to generally need a permit or a water right associated with it if it's not coal bed methane. However, let's imagine that an operator is interested in producing water from a type 2 injection well for utilization in oil and gas operations. So not water that's coming out from their existing operations, but one that's like repurposing an injection well. How would the Division of Water Resources consider that, I guess?
Well, that's a question I've never heard before, John. So, I mean, you're talking about using water that was injected. It's not like any kind of natural water. It's actually water that's been injected as a waste product. Am I following you correctly so far?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And or whatever non-tributary water may be in that formation that water has been injected
Yeah.
into.
So there's an allowance to use non-tributary aquifers basically as underground storage reservoirs. And it sounds to me like that's what you're talking about, because basically you're injecting the waste product and maybe you're wanting to just bring it back up for later use. And it's sort of like an underground reservoir. You just stored it in temporarily. So I think you could probably just operate under the rules for that non-tributary injection and later extraction, which is basically, it's like a bank account. One goes in, one goes out. I'm oversimplifying, but there's an allowance for that, although I've never heard of anyone, contemplating a type 2 injection well like you're talking about, but maybe it fits.
And in that scenario, so I mean, you've got multiple operators injecting, EMP waste into these wells. I guess who owns that water at that point if it's not tributary water? Does someone have the ability to take it out of that and sell it, or I'm just kind of curious about how that would all work.
Yeah. So non-tributary water that is not produced non-tributary water, just non-tributary water, like in the Denver Basin aquifer, which is below much of the Denver metro area. Some of that water is non-tributary and it's just withdrawn through regular water wells, not produced water. That ownership is based on the quantity of water underlying the land, underlying my 5 acres that I own, let's say. There's a quantity of water and I own that. And I can use it. Let's just leave it at that. If I want to inject, store water and take it back out, I also have the right to do that. So we know how to do that kind of operation, and the ownership isn't really a problem. I guess I would say what you're talking about is something we've not contemplated before, where you've got multiple operators. I feel like the operators could work together on some type of joint project where they're going to, I guess, work with whoever that landowner is and account for the water they're putting in and taking out. There would probably be a way to do it. It does get into land ownership. And I know I didn't talk about land ownership for produced non-tributary water because it is actually managed different and it doesn't concern land ownership. But for your idea of an injection well, storing water and then taking it out for reuse, I think you'd have to also think about land ownership and sort of just, it would be an accounting mechanism of water in versus water out.
Okay, I may put it in the parking lot for future discussion because I am kind of curious about this, and I know we're running a little bit out of time. But Jeff, you had your hand up, so
yeah, just a quick comment regarding that question. It's important to note that oftentimes operators that are injecting into a pore space that is owned by a service owner, an agreement typically has been negotiated where that operator might be, say, paying a couple cents or up to a couple dollars per barrel to inject that water. There's already, and we operate on federal land, so there is this, circumstance there where federal wells that or injection wells that are located in federal pore space are similar to a right-of-way require some level of a grant or a dollar amount that's paid annually based on the number of barrels. So there are some mechanisms that are already in place to sort of, I guess, value at least the injection and the volumes that are injected into that injection well. But in terms of this concept of then producing that injection well for reuse, I can tell you that's a question we've asked a lot and never been able to get an answer to. So I'm really excited about this conversation, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, Hope, let's put that on a further agenda for further discussion at some point if we have room. So, Barbara, last question, and then I do want to make sure we're cognizant of folks' time there.
I put it in the chat. Respect everybody's time.
Okay. And I do know that there's some questions in the chat, and so Hope, let's grab those questions and ask folks who those questions are directed to perhaps answer those questions in a written format, and then we can provide those answers to the consortium members as well. Because I think there were some good questions in there too, and I know that we didn't have enough time to get all of the questions asked today. So we'll expand our question and answer time after presentations for future meetings so that everyone is able to exhaust their questions, because I think the questions are important, the discussions are important, and appreciate everyone participating. But with that, unless anyone has any last comments, and I'm looking at you, Hope, or anyone else that may have any last comments, appreciate everyone being here today and participating. A huge thanks to our presenters for providing information. I thought that was a lot of really good information there, and I've got a litany of notes that I've taken there, and I think maybe we can summarize some of those questions, and I'm happy to provide some additional questions that I would love to have answered as well. And we can get those done between meetings. But yeah, appreciate everyone's participation, and I hope everyone has a great holiday weekend, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in future meetings. And so look for additional information that'll come from Hope. And as always, if anyone has any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to give me a call or email me. Always happy to chat. With that, I am concluding the Produced Water Consortium meeting today. So everyone have a great weekend. Thanks.
Thank you.